All right, so hopefully virtually everyone has made it into the room. Happy Friday, everyone. It's a beautiful day here in Chicago. So if you're in the Midwest, hopefully you can sneak out a little bit early. We're very glad that you've joined us for this important session. So I'd like to welcome Greg Valliere here from AGF. He has been a frequent guest of ours in the past. Great insights around policy, politics, especially around midterm election cycles and general elections, and just the influence of these matters on the markets. If we need evidence that these are important, you only need to look at the UK and the very quick ascension and fall of Liz Truss and policy to see how quickly things can change and how policy does matter to markets. So Greg, first of all, thank you so much for being with us today.
Happy to be here.
So why don't we just start? We've got 30 minutes here. By the way, questions are available. If you have a question for Greg, please just put it in the chat queue. We'll try to get to it throughout the next 30 minutes, or if we can't get to it, we'll follow up with you after. But Greg, let's just start at the heart of the matter. What are the key things in your mind that are at stake today? I know there's a lot kind of floating out there, but what are the key items that you would say we should really hone in on before we talk elections? Now let's talk policy.
Sure. I think that it's important to get predictability, Brad, on policies. And I think this election increasingly looks like we're going to get predictability. We're going to have the House flip back to the Republicans. That's a great story for investors to know that we'll probably go through 2023, 24 without any significant changes at all on capital gains, the estate tax, the step-up basis, top rate. So first and foremost, I think you can't guarantee anything to the markets, but you can offer predictability. And I do think that that's coming in this election.
With predictability, to your point, right? Markets dislike uncertainty more than they dislike bad news, right? At least they know what to do with bad news. But unpredictable means it creates additional anxiety. As we look at a lot of the policies that are on the table, I think when we started the year, many were thinking, "Hey, there's a lot at stake for the midterm elections," and there still is. But there's also been a pretty productive agenda out of the White House and accomplishing either through IRA, through China Competition Act, or others, that have kind of lessened maybe some of that lack of predictability because it's already come through. So what are the key things that you still think are floating out there and that are important for us as investors to focus in on?
I would say Ukraine, and Ukraine. I think that is still a huge issue. If we get even a hint at talks, and there was a conversation this morning between the U.S. Defense Secretary and his Russian counterpart, I was encouraged to see that. But I think that if we have some sign that this could come to a resolution during the winter, that's really, I think, important because it would lessen the chances of a European recession, and it would lessen inflationary pressure on grains, on metals, on natural gas, you name it. So I think Ukraine is still a huge uncertainty. And I think the biggest part of that uncertainty during the winter will be whether Western Europe and even the US starts to waver. Will we see big protests in Western Europe? Will we see U.S. politicians saying we don't want to spend all this money on Ukraine? That's a risk. I don't think we're going to see a lack of resolve, but that is one element of uncertainty you can't deny.
Let's break that down a little bit more, Greg, because your comments, I think, are important, right, about Ukraine. And many have been thinking, all right, it's U.S. midterm elections, it's U.S. elections, it's the shift in the Senate or the House. But when it comes to Ukraine, it's not just the United States, it's the proverbial West, it's Europe. So how have you seen, or what are you seeing in regards to kind of politics and relations globally on the incremental change? I think everyone came out of the gate and said, this is horrible. We're here, we're together, unprecedented sanctions against Russia. What's the incremental change? You see that remaining strong or potentially waning?
I think first and foremost, Brad, this is one of the most remarkable stories of my career, to see the Russian army in total disarray. I think that's the big change. We could talk about lots of angles here. It's a fascinating story, but I think you've got Russian troops in utter chaos and retreat. I talked to someone at the Pentagon a few days ago who tells me that we think 50,000 Russian troops have been killed, with 50,000 wounded. At least a dozen generals have been killed, reportedly some of them by their own troops. And now you see hundreds of thousands of young Russians leaving Moscow and St. Petersburg, going to Istanbul, going to Helsinki. It's a remarkable sight to see the Russian army in utter retreat. Those of us who read history are reminded by 1918, when the Russian troops gave up. They went back to Russia at the end of World War I, and maybe we're starting to see something similar. But my bottom line is quite simple. The Russian troops are not willing to die for Vladimir Putin, whereas the Ukrainian troops are willing to die for their country.
Yeah, resolve certainly becomes a matter of measure of success when it comes to a time of war. But Greg, you mentioned 1, 2, and 3, Ukraine, 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 and we just got a question in, which is a great question. That there's an inherent assumption that the idea of positive resolve or at the negotiating table, that if that happens, that's going to come with additional benefits in trade agreements, or potentially reopening things like Nord Stream 2 pipelines, and kind of the unfortunate timing of winter. Do you think that that's a fair assumption, right? Because there's not necessarily a bucket of just aggression or war-based resolution and economic-based resolution.
Great question. And there are still obviously big wild cards. For example, what if somebody took out Putin, some aggressive young general, maybe supported by oligarchs? Well, first of all, you don't know if Putin's replacement might be worse. You can't be sure of that. You don't know if Putin departs the scene. There would still be a great deal of instability brought about by all of the hawks, all of the hardliners in Moscow who want something more aggressive. What if Putin does stay and he dramatically increases the amount of weapons he's willing to use, including a tactical nuclear weapon, which would not destroy huge amounts of land? It might destroy 3 or 4 city blocks. It might put off some radiation. So there is still an enormous amount of uncertainties. The one thing that I think we have to concede is that it's virtually impossible to come up with a scenario whereby Russia wins the war by any definition of the word win. I think truce talks would begin later in the winter, and if it does, there is one issue that dwarfs all other issues, and it's going to be a really tough issue to resolve, and that, of course, is Crimea. Russia views Crimea almost as sacred. Zelensky is unwilling to give up Crimea. So it's going to take a very clever intermediary, maybe like Erdogan of Turkey, somebody like that. So the questioner is right. Even though I can spin a slightly more positive story, there are still some big wild cards.
Now, speaking of wild cards, another question that came in, and obviously hard to read tea leaves on this, but you mentioned it just a moment ago, the idea of nuclear threat.
Yep.
Russia has been a nuclear power for quite some time. That has been their trump card, if you will, or ace in the hole when it comes to their stance or status in geopolitics. Vladimir Putin has given indication, right, of any measure necessary to win or protect sovereignty now that they've assimilated some local areas of Ukraine. So as you try to break down that likelihood of if Russia does not succeed, or at least succeed in the way they define success at the beginning of this, does that mean that Russia could or may use some type of nuclear option, like a tactical nuclear option?
I would put the chances at well below 50%. First of all, many of his generals reportedly have made it clear that they would oppose any directive from Putin to use even a small tactical nuclear weapon. They don't know which way the wind would be blowing. What if they used it and the wind turned and went onto Russian soldiers? I mean, I don't think Putin gives a damn. He views these soldiers as, fungible fodder. But I think the generals would be opposed to something like that, number one. Number two, I think that you'd have to conclude that Russia would become the ultimate global pariah. They would be cut off from all trade. There would be no exceptions. I think Russia would be isolated by the rest of the world, and they would lose the very few allies they have. China, for example, I can't see Xi going along. I think he would speak out harshly. I think Modi of India would speak out harshly. So I think that Russia would be taking an enormous risk if they did that. I think Putin is, well, he's delusional, but I don't think he's stupid. I don't think he would take a chance of isolating Russia as a pariah for years to come by doing this.
I think he's already certainly taken a step in that direction, but not to maybe that same magnitude. But
Yep.
maybe shifting our gaze a little bit off of Ukraine for a moment, but impacts here in the U.S. What does Russia's advance in Ukraine, or you mentioned, President Xi a moment ago in flexing or saber rattling maybe over Taiwan and sovereignty. What does that do for U.S. Defense spending and kind of bringing our gaze back onshore? And we'll shift back to Asia in a moment. But how do you see that playing out here in the U.S.? And does that have an influence today on elections that we see in a few weeks?
Yes, and I tell you, Brad, I've said this for quite some time. The purest investment play in Washington today is the defense sector. I mean, I'm not a stock picker, so I can't tell you, go buy Raytheon or, General Dynamics, whatever. I don't follow the stocks, but I do follow the defense spending trajectory, which is straight up. It looks like in this new fiscal year, which began on October 1, we could spend $800 billion on defense. And I think within a year or two, we'll be at 1 trillion on defense. And it's quite clear that in both parties, there's a sentiment that maybe we need to spend more, especially on shipbuilding, because of threats in the South China Sea and in the Persian Gulf. Leaving China alone for a second, as you suggest, I would just say that a threat that has to be acknowledged is Iran. I mean, these are some bad guys. The Ayatollahs, the way they treat women, the way they threaten Israel. Most intelligence sources believe the Iranians are within a few months of developing a crude nuclear bomb. They don't have the delivery capability yet, but I think Iran is going to become an increasing irritant in the Persian Gulf, and I think they could become really provocative in that part of the world.
For a moment there, I thought I heard you say that the left and the right were in agreement on something.
Yeah.
That sounds incredible.
Right. Absolutely. Where there's some disagreement, just quickly, some of the Trump Republicans, especially ones running for the Senate, are beginning to say they don't want to spend much more money on Ukraine. Why should we give them a blank check? We have problems here at home. It's not a majority of the Republicans, but I would say when you look at the politics in Washington, maybe 60% of the Republicans want to spend a lot more on defense, maybe 30 or 40% of the Democrats. So I'd say there's enough of a coalition to get quite a bit more spending on defense in the next year or two.
Got it. So to your point, why don't we shift our gaze to kind of the South China Sea, the
Yeah.
CCP or Chinese Congressional Communist Party just went through their election, and she is firmly entrenched in a third term. So your point on chip spending, defense spending, where does China, as the world's second largest economy, in your opinion, from a geopolitical perspective, start to come in here? We've seen the China Competition Act. We've seen recent regulations around chips and semiconductors. So what is your?
Well, I'd make 2 points, and you broke up a bit at the end, but I got the question. I'd make 2 points. The first is, in Washington, still another bipartisan area of agreement. There's a widespread belief that China doesn't play fair, that China is a bad actor. There's a widespread belief that they were not transparent on COVID, that they treat their dissidents horribly, that they spy on all of the US companies, and of course they covet Taiwan. So there's not a lot of love for China in both parties in Washington. And frankly, I think Joe Biden doesn't want to get too involved because there's always this sensitive issue of Hunter Biden and how he has had dealings with the Chinese. So that's the first point I'd make. I think they'll stay at arm's length. The second point I'd make is that I think Xi is pragmatic. I think he is not in a rush to invade Taiwan. I think he would worry that coffins would start to come back to Beijing, just as coffins have gone back to Moscow. I think that Xi knows that the sanctions would be enormous on China, which is a big trading country. So I think the rhetoric could continue to be hostile, but I don't see action. I don't see China anytime soon going after Taiwan.
Do you see that? So your point on sanctions or potential sanctions should China take steps in Taiwan. Many have used the parallel of Russia and Ukraine with China and Taiwan, but Russia's influence in very narrow areas of the market, especially in Europe and energy, are material or grains. But China's a whole different animal in regards to production of goods and shipments and where the role they play in the global economy. So would you, if China simply took extremely action to Russia as they did in Taiwan, would you expect a same rise of say West in thwarting that?
I think we've already seen a reaction in the U.S. toward China, and that's the CHIPS bill that united, once again, going back to your theme, which it makes a lot of sense. This united Chuck Schumer and a bunch of Republicans, and they passed legislation to fund U.S. chip manufacturing here in America, also to help manufacturers of medical goods, pharmaceuticals. So clearly there's a move to bring some of this manufacturing back to the U.S. And I think that trend will continue.
Kind of the onshoring or friendshoring, of inflation related issues and kind of some of the things that we've learned from, the COVID area, perhaps. Why don't we shift a little bit related to China, but also the midterm elections on just tech regulation, tech policy. Clearly an important sector of the U.S. economy and especially of the U.S. markets, and obviously one that IP is starting to form a battle between China and the U.S. So what are your views on technology regulation and policy at play here in the U.S.?
Well, I might be a little contrarian, but my bottom line is I don't think much is going to happen. And I say that because each party has radically different goals. The Republicans feel they're being censored and that the tech companies should allow more freedom of expression. The Democrats, on the other hand, view this as an issue of concentration that is more of an antitrust problem and a need to crack down on regulations. The bottom line to me is that there's no bill pending, including a bill from Amy Klobuchar, which moved a little bit in her committee this year. But there's no bill pending that I see to crack down on the tech companies. I don't see any imminent or even midterm possibility that we would see a dramatic breakup of the tech companies like we saw the telephone companies a couple of decades ago, which, by the way, took 8-10 years. So I don't sense a mood in Congress that would be conducive to putting together any kind of legislation that would hurt the tech sector. I mean, there will be antitrust prosecution if concentration gets too heavy. And there is a desire in Western Europe to crack down on some US tech companies. But I think the regulatory and legislative threat to the tech sector is not that big.
So maybe tying tech and at least semiconductors back to China here, we did have a question come in on, so the US thus far has, for the first time in a long time, been on offense with regulations around China in the Competition Act and semiconductors and chips. What is China's view back to the US? Usually it feels like it's more tit for tat, at least in the Trump administration on, you tax this, I'll tax that. It's been fairly quiet. So what's the next shoe to drop here on the way back?
Well, I do think that Biden, once we get through the election, that Biden will want to talk face to face, maybe with Xi. I do think, maybe we'll get into this later in the call, Brad, but I do think that around Christmas time or maybe the beginning of next year, Biden will announce that he is not seeking a second term. That opens up a lot of possibilities. I just think that he He knows he has health issues. He knows if the Republicans take the House, which is almost certain, there'll be a hearing on Hunter Biden every day. He knows that he's not going to get much more of his agenda done. So I think Biden says he's not seeking another term, which then opens things up. That means that he can sort of be an honest broker, and he could go to China and say, let's talk about some of these issues. But as long as we wait until there's an announcement he's not running, I think it's going to be difficult to get much done with China.
So before we, because I do want to end on, kind of reading tea leaves into the midterm here and potential shifts in the House and Senate, and then, your views coming in the general election.
Sure.
Why don't we talk quickly about potential tax and tax reform?
Yep.
Obviously, most of the investors on the line, or at least everybody on the call, personally pays tax, but many work for individuals on an after-tax basis. So what are your thoughts on potential change in tax in the coming months?
I think it's an unabashedly positive story for the markets. I mentioned earlier that there's not going to be anything on taxes in 23, 24, because anything the White House might propose to raise capital gains or raise the estate tax would die in the House. I mean, Kevin McCarthy will replace Nancy Pelosi. That's quite a shift, you might say, ideologically. So I don't see any big threat that taxes will get raised or changed. And that's good after all the dysfunction we've seen on taxes. Now, we will have to debate in 3 or 4 years some of the Trump tax cuts that expire in the middle of this decade. So my assurance that there'll be nothing in 23, 24 may have to have an expiration date. It's possible by 25, 26, we'll be back at it talking about new taxes. I'm just happy to see a couple of years without any big threat of tax changes.
Fair enough. So why don't we jump into kind of midterm and then, your kind of longer term gaze on the general election. So, what are your thoughts and views of as we get closer and closer to election day? How's the Senate shaping up? How's the House shaping up? And what are your thoughts on potential shifts in power?
This has been an election of momentum swings, sort of like in the markets. And I think in the last few weeks, there's been an unmistakable swing toward the Republicans. 2 or 3 reasons. Number one, Hispanic voters have shifted pretty sharply toward the Republicans. I think Democrats have taken Hispanic voters for granted. Number two, on polls that I've seen, the anxiety over urban crime, whether it's New York, Chicago, LA, San Francisco, that anxiety has gone up significantly, and it's helped the Republicans. And number three, a lot of analysts who expected abortion to be a dynamite issue, a huge issue, have been surprised. On lists of issues that the public cares the most about, abortion is down at like number 4 or number 5 or number 6. It obviously affects some voters who will be angry and will turn out to vote because of it. But it looks like it's not going to be as dominant as we thought. Thus, therefore, my forecast is that the House unquestionably shifts back to the Republicans. They only need 5 seats. And I'm thinking they're probably going to get 15, maybe 20. There are some analysts who are even higher than that. The Senate is a tough call. I'm even there beginning to think the momentum is shifting a bit toward the Democrats. The Senate is tied 50-50. I think there's probably a slightly better chance the Republicans have a net gain of 1. They only need 1. But even if the Republicans don't take the Senate, the big story is the House. The House will block any kind of progressive legislation, activist legislation, and that's a good story for the markets.
And so you think we end up in a spot where obviously you've got a kind of a blue, led executive branch. We have at the very least, divided, if not red, legislative branch, and that leads to kind of less material changes incoming and more predictability, to your point.
Absolutely. I would say also that a persistent theme, maybe we can spend a minute on, Brad, is how both fiscal and monetary policy has gotten more restrictive. I mean, we all know about the Fed. We all know they're going to do 75 basis points on the 1st of November, probably 50 in mid-December. So you've got a restrictive Fed, although I think they'll start rhetorically sounding a little more dovish as we get into the winter. But for now, it's a restrictive Fed monetary policy and a restrictive fiscal policy. There's a widespread belief in a lot of these new members who are going to get elected that after the pandemic, we spent too much money. And I think there's going to be a reaction, and you're going to see a much tighter fiscal policy on spending. So you'll have tight monetary and fiscal policies for at least another, few months on fiscal at least.
Got it. So seeing some more questions coming in and recognizing we've only got just a few minutes left, we can try to hit some of these. We did get a question about how do you see loan forgiveness playing out?
Good question. It's being challenged legally, although one court yesterday sided in Biden's favor. But I think that it'll be litigated in several courts and before eventually becoming a consolidated case that goes to the Supreme Court. It's a tough issue. I mean, Biden has just arbitrarily spent $380 billion on student loan relief. He didn't get this approved by Congress. He just decreed they were going to spend an extra $380 billion. And there are a lot of people, not all conservatives, who feel that is an abuse of presidential power. There's also the argument that a lot of us, myself included, paid every dime of my student loan going into my 30s. So it's going to be a hot button issue, but it's going to be one for the courts for the next several months.
Yeah. And we just maybe wrapping up here in the last couple of minutes, what are the things that are on your mind that maybe aren't front of mind for most investors or those on the call? Is there anything out there around the corner that we should be paying attention to?
Oh, there's so many things, but I'll be brief. Let me first of all say that you have to acknowledge that U.S. energy policy is dysfunctional. It finally dawned on this administration that it's not all about drilling and exploration. It's about refining. It's about transporting it. And I think they finally realized that bashing the fossil fuel industry was not a real smart move as gasoline prices got over $5 a gallon. But if there's one sleeper issue that nobody's talking about right now, and we're going to have to address, it's water. It's water from the Colorado River going into California, Arizona, Nevada. At some point, there's going to have to be a focus on desalinization. I know it's very expensive, but we have to address water in the next couple of years. And if we don't, it'll be to our peril.
Yeah. Well, Greg, we very much appreciate you spending the time with us. Thanks for calling in from your New Jersey hotel room while on the road. We appreciate it. But for those on the line, if you have any additional questions, always please feel free to reach out. We're happy to connect you with AGF and or an individual at Fiducient Advisors. So thanks, everyone. We appreciate your time. And Greg, thanks again.
Thanks, Brad. I enjoyed it.
All right. Bye-bye.